Welcome everyone to the East Bay DSA's Capital Class lecture number 6 here at the East Bay DSA Center in Oakland. And thanks for joining me on this beautiful day and Labor Day weekend. Um, yeah, uh, we're gonna get through this one, I think, a little faster. So hopefully there's some time for questions too. So just keep that in mind. It won't be the hour and 10-minute marathon. It's been a couple of the last ones, which has been fun too. But okay. So where we are at now, according to this lecture, we should have finished through chapter 13. That's what we're going to be covering this time is 10 through 13. If people are a little behind or ahead, that's also great. But that's the idea here, and that's the chapter on machinery. And then I wanted to say that we're going to just keep doing this building the layers of Marx's argument. So just keep that in mind. And there's going to be a couple key ideas from earlier sections that are going to come back into this lecture. So you'll see some of the layers get added. And then I also just wanted to frame these chapters, which is chapter 10, the concept of relative surplus value, all the way through machinery and large-scale industry, as basically where Marx is considering technological transformation under capitalism. So that's really this is a big chunk of the book, and it's covering something that obviously is quite important and affects all of our lives and is very obvious, which is that we live technologically in a totally different world today than people did in the 1830s or 1750s. So yeah, let's jump into it. Okay. Starting with chapter 10, the concept of relative surplus value. And I covered this a little bit in the last lecture, so there might be a tiny bit of review for people who saw that one. But basically, we're shifting now in the book from this idea of absolute surplus value to the idea of relative surplus value. And this is helpful for me, so I just want to frame it. I like to think of these two things less as like things and more as processes. So it's ways capital is working to extract surplus value. And we're going to get into a little bit what the distinction between the two is more later. But, we've talked about this process of producing absolute surplus value, the working day chapter, right? Pushing the working day forward. And now we're going to shift to the process of producing relative surplus value, which is about pushing back the necessary labor part of the day, the part of the day that is equivalent to the wages you earn. And so how does this shortening of the necessary labor happen? And again, this is just sort of setting the stage. But if you remember from last lecture or a couple lectures ago, we talked about how we've shifted now from circulation to production. And so in the realm of circulation, we talked about commodities being traded, things being bought and sold, the rules of sort of commodity exchange, including people selling their labor power and getting wages. And now we're shifting into production, and we're sort of presuming the ideal case in circulation. So we're presuming that when you sell your labor power and you get a wage in return, you're getting the value of your labor power. You're not being cheated, right? You're not being given almost nothing, pennies to work. Obviously, that's something that happens, but it's not what we're looking for to explain how the necessary labor part has decreased. And I appreciate the troopers over here who are jumping into this without the previous lectures, or at least, but feel free to ask any questions if you want. Yeah, so we're trying to think about what's going on in production, and that means that we're not talking about someone just paying labor power too little. We're not talking about reducing the wage so it's so small you can barely buy anything, right? We're talking about something else. And really, it's productivity, right? So that's why I framed it as the technological change at the beginning. We're talking about how productivity increase affects capitalism or works in capitalism. And to frame productivity based on, sort of the terms we've been using here, reducing the number of socially necessary labor time that goes to working people and their reproduction, to the means of subsistence, or to the commodities that we need to live. So this is an example from the last lecture, but right, we used to produce wheat in a certain way, peasant hand production. an hour of labor might get embodied in 1 bushel of wheat. That is no longer true. Now we have a sort of highly industrial, actually, agricultural production system. 1 hour of socially necessary labor time is embodied in something like 12 bushels of wheat. And so each bushel is not an hour, but just 5 minutes of social labor. And so it's that transformation. You're getting the same amount of wheat to eat, the same amount of bread, but socially, a lot less labor is being devoted to reproducing you and your lifestyle. And so if we zoom out from just wheat and we take all of the different commodities that we're using every day, whether that's the food, the medicinal products, the personal products, the apartment, the clothes, the car nowadays, the phone, the computer nowadays, all these sorts of things. Well, that forms the overall means of subsistence. Um, and like we said in past lectures, right, the necessary labor or the value of labor power, the amount you get when you sell your labor power, is the amount it takes to reproduce yourself, which is these means of subsistence. And so basically, this 6 hours of labor ultimately is equal to the amount of labor time that goes into all these various commodities that we use every day. And so the question we're asking now is, how can we reduce the number of hours that go into all the daily commodities? How can we take less time? How can we reduce that necessary labor time so that, just to put it right in sort of a more Marxist lens, when you work just 3 hours at your job in the day, those 3 hours actually socially, in terms of social labor, represent all the labor that needs to be done to support you for that day. Um, okay. And so the answer to this question, I think, is obvious to everyone who lives today. And it's right. The vast processes of automation and industrial production, whether it's in agriculture, whether it's for home goods, whether it's in the literal construction of buildings, or the same industry that we talk a lot about in Capital, the textile industry. So I'll just let these play for a little bit. But you can see here, the farming of corn is totally industrialized, as is its processing, right? And it's like monitoring for quality, sometimes the stripping of the various, the leaves. This is actually a building in China. I think it's like an 80-something story building that was built in 2 months. And then this is just washing machine production over here on the top right. You can see all the sort of machines for stamping the metal, moving it along, processing it. That's setting up the PCBs that run the machine, right? And then this is, again, that old textile factory, which sewing still looks not too different than it did a long time ago, but the production of the actual fabric has been, revolutionized again. So in all these ways, right, we've seen basically the huge leaps forward in productivity that bring down the amount of social hours that go into all these necessary products. And so just to frame it sort of in other terms, or in the way actually Marx frames it when we start the chapter, when we talk about absolute surplus value, we're talking about increasing the length of the working day, basically. That's the typical example. It also includes other things that sort of equate to increasing the length of the working day, right? So we talked about, inferior conditions that shorten your life. Well, that's sort of stealing working days from the future. Enforced super intensity that makes you so exhausted that you can't work past 40. Again, sort of stealing time from the future. But in all these various ways, they sort of come down to this basic paradigm of increasing the amount of work you're taking each day. And Marx basically condemns this process. This is like directly a class relation of exploitation. And just to go through the chart here, right? So if you get 8 hours of wages per day, that's the necessary, basket of goods is worth about $8 a day. And then workers work 8 hours and necessary labor is just half, then you get 8 hours of profit. As you start pushing the day forward, you get more and more profit, right? On the other hand, we have relative surplus value production. This is raising productivity without raising wages, or without raising real wages, you could say. The same basket of goods, the same, in this case, pay per hour, But now that pay, rather than being represented in, 2/3 of the day, is just 1/3. So at the beginning, $8 per hour, you get $12 total. So hours of profit. Sorry. By the end, each hour, you're only getting paid for $8, but you're making 24 total. And so there's a huge increase in profit, right? And I'll just note that this, I think, idea, if you're someone who thinks about it with economics a lot, you get tripped up by inflation and some of these other thoughts. So you can spend some time looking through it, but it's basically right that, as you move the time back, you might still be getting the same amount in dollars, you might still be getting the same amount really in goods, and there's more of the day, more of each hour that's devoted to basically profit for the capitalist. And Marx has more mixed feelings about this process of extracting surplus value. And I think sometimes in the way Marx is presented, it's presented as if he has actually pretty much good feelings for this, right? The driving forward of the technological process and bringing new inventions and new productivity. But that is definitely not true if you read the book, and as people have been doing. He has a lot of bad things to say. And so it's definitely like a sort of mixed, I would say, mixed review of relative surplus value extraction. Yeah. Do you want to get a mic? Actually, is that all right? Thank you.
Well, it's a short question. In relative surplus value here in this graph, we are assuming the worker works the same number of hours, but the productivity is increased through other means.
That's correct.
That's all I wanted to understand.
Thanks for that clarification. And Marx actually does that, right? In the chapter, he says, let's say the working day has been limited by the factory law, for example. How do you get relative surplus value? By pushing back that necessary part. And so I just wanted to maybe also frame this in terms people are potentially familiar with, but how many people have seen a version of this graph? Is this something? Okay, yeah. Somewhat universal. I think it became a meme. But just to like think through this same graph in the terms Marx is saying, right? This is literally a huge expansion in relative surplus value production. Because workers since the 70s are basically getting the same means of subsistence, right? Real wages have not changed. The basket of goods, someone will let, thank you, Molly. The basket of goods has not really changed, but productivity has about doubled since then. So the amount of hours that are going into those same basket of goods has decreased by half, right? And so all those hours have now gone to the rich, the wealthy. Thus, you see this huge shift in inequality, right? But just another way of thinking through it by looking at, somewhat of an example that I think people are a little familiar with. Yeah. Yeah, please. I like a little more back and forth.
I've used this graph to talk to people, and some of the things that I remarked with it, you're talking about around 1970, 75. What happened there was lots more women went into the workforce because you needed suddenly two wage earners to raise a family, and also the whole credit card and borrowing industry was created around that time because people started borrowing on future wages to make ends meet, kind of stuff. So all of that started all around the same time. Big cultural change came at that period.
Oh yeah. Yeah. In a sense, neoliberalism is a common word too for it. And I think I'm being really I'm simplifying it a lot but one of the ways I was having fun looking at this graph during this lecture was just thinking, in a sense, you could see neoliberalism looking at this graph as just one gigantic attack by capital to extract huge amounts of relative surplus value from existing production and life. And I'll just note really quickly, right? We talked about how inflation can trip people up a little bit here. In that first part, it doesn't mean profits aren't increasing, right? It just means workers are getting some share of that increase. But it's really stark once you see this divergence here. Okay, and I'm going to jump forward and frame it in a slightly different way, which is we sort of built up this diagram in some of the earlier lectures, if you remember, of sort of how the overall social division of labor and capitalism works. where you have on the one hand, wage workers, on the other hand, independent capitalist firms, and then basically workers are selling their labor power, and then they're buying what they need on the market. Firms are also exchanging on the market, selling on the market, but more and more of what's produced ends up going to the rich, whether that's, you know, rocket ships, mansions, new factories, military equipment, et cetera. And when we talk about relative surplus value, basically we're talking about shrinking the amount that's going through this cycle of supporting the working class and growing the amount that's available for, in part, new investment, but in many places, just huge new luxury enjoyment of the rich and wealthy. And so I wanted to actually use one other angle to attack this same idea, which is this myth. I think I actually maybe went over this a bit in the last lecture, so hopefully it's not too much review. But this is a myth from Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, where he sort of tells the story of how, you know, work leads to technological development and innovation. And he has this 13-year-old boy who basically figures out that if he ties one part of the steam engine that he's working on to another part of the steam engine, it does the work he's doing for him. And thus he gets to go home and fish and be free. And this is sort of a infamous story, you could say, because it became obvious, I think, to many people writing after Adam Smith, including Marx, that that is actually not how the story ends, right? The boy does not get freed from the labor and then get to go fish. There are sort of two possibilities that await this boy. One, they are just doing the exact same work on a different machine or in a different place in the factory. Or two, they are unemployed and now are not making money that their family needed. And so this is sort of just this larger frame, right, of like, what does machinery achieve in this sort of capitalist structure? And it is not achieving this sort of greater leisure of the actual working people, right? It's achieving something else. It's achieving that increasing mass of goods that's going to the rich, to the wealthy. Okay, so this is happening society-wide. But how does the individual capitalist push for increased productivity lead them to get more surplus value? And this is a key issue in sort of the second part of this chapter, is Marx tries to basically explain, I've talked about this socially, right? If you're reducing the necessary labor hours, we sort of talked it through. It's all that basket of goods. It's the apartment, you know, it's the medicine, it's all these various things. How does me, as an individual capitalist, becoming more productive lead to me getting more surplus value? And so you sort of have to look a little deeper here. And Marx has this section where he basically says, you know, we're not really looking at this right now. We're going to look at it in volume 3, actually. But we're not really looking at how these immanent laws I'm laying out actually appear in the external movement of individual masses of capital, or how they operate as the inviolable laws of competition. But this much is already clear. We can analyze competition systematically only once we understand capital's inner nature. And I just say I always like this slide because he sort of compares it to Galileo. And he says, right, like, you can have a sense of how the planets move, but if you don't understand the laws of motion, you don't really have an understanding of why they're doing what they're doing or what's going on. And so in a sense, what we've gotten to and what we're really doing in this first volume is this inner nature, this laws of motion question. And he's going to get to some of these later things in volume 3. But for relative surplus value, he gives us a quick and dirty answer, I would say, which is basically that when a labor process is more productive than average, it ends up counting socially as if the necessary labor time has been decreased. And so just to work through it here, right? A working day at average productivity, let's say there's 6 hours of necessary labor, 6 hours of surplus labor. If you double the productivity of that working day, but socially nothing else has changed, your labor socially counts as 2 days of labor, right? It counts as 2 days of social labor. It counts as twice the socially necessary labor time. And so in a sense now, there's 6 hours of socially necessary labor time still as necessary, but there's 18 hours of surplus value. Or if you shrink it back down to the normal working day, now in just 3 hours, the worker is basically working off their wages. And so basically, if a firm is more productive or advanced, they end up producing a lot of extra surplus value. The labor time of workers, on the other hand, at the less productive or less advanced firms does not fully count as socially necessary. And so there's this rough and tumble, very, very intense capitalist competition between firms, a race to see who can be the most productive. And if you're ahead in that race, you get surplus profits. If you're behind, you end up getting little profit, no profit. You might even take losses or collapse, right? So it's this dynamic of a constant race where the people who are ahead are getting rewarded is how it plays out sort of in society. And I just want to take a quick aside here and say, in the last lecture, we talked about basically surplus and average profit also. This is really covered in volume 3, but we basically found now a second role for surplus profit. And so within a single branch of production, this is what we've been talking about. If you're technologically ahead, if you're more productive, if you're producing relative surplus value, you're part of sort of the wave of producing it, you get extra profit, you get surplus profit. And then what we talked about last time is that basically surplus profit and average profit regulate the distribution of capitals among all the various branches of industry. So why is there the right amount of capital producing cars versus the right amount of capital producing, wheat, all these various things we need? Because the market prices are pushing capital into this sort of alignment. And if it's out of alignment, it either is getting a bunch of extra profits because it's where everyone should be, or it's losing money. And this is how, right, that balance between, some people having huge amounts of machines and almost no workers, and some people having tons of workers ends up getting balanced out. So basically, a brief preview into volume 3, but we're going to basically talk about how surplus profits end up doing a number of these sort of different functions in the competition between capitals. I just wanted to note that I think I said that last time, but if this is getting too far for you, one of the things I've found is helpful is just like an intellectual tool, is saying basically, in volume 1, we're really thinking of capital almost as if it's like one social entity. And that's sort of how we're imagining it. And this sort of competition between capitals, in a sense, is just reflecting the fact that actually every little capitalist firm is just a part of that social entity. And they just have a ticket to the surplus value of society, right? They have their right. And so the competition between the firms is actually just establishing the logic of capital as a social entity. Sorry, that was a little deep into the outside of this section, but I did want to cover it quickly. And then just to come back to relative surplus value, right? Basically what Marx says is that we should see relative surplus value from two sides. So for an individual firm, there's this constant race to increase productivity. If you fall behind, you'll make below average profits. If you get ahead, you make these surplus profits, You're rushing for those. For society as a whole, productivity increases society-wide as all these firms are rushing to become more productive. This means, on the whole, right, that the means of subsistence can be made with less labor, which is exactly what we've been talking about, right? The necessary labor time decreases. The amount of labor that's going into our means of subsistence decreases, and thus all capitalists get more relative surplus value. So you want to sort of see it from these two angles at the same time. And then I just wanted to say, essentially, right, this whole process, the process of producing relative surplus value, is the process of reducing the amount of socially necessary labor hours and thus also social wealth that goes to the working class. Because less and less socially necessary labor time is required to produce all the needs of the working class. Yeah, as a percentage. Thank you. And I'll just say there's another sort of factor that I think we see a lot today here that comes in, and Marx even mentions it. But when labor power becomes socially cheaper, when it takes less social hours, the rich end up buying armies of servants. So Marx actually mentions this in that chapter. If you remember, he talks about how each rich capitalist has a an estate in the countryside, and they have someone manning their horses and someone trimming their lawns. And we see a world relatively similar today. I just pulled this article, I think it was from last month's Wall Street Journal, that talks about how many staff people are basically engaged in every mansion of every super rich person, which you read about them selling and buying them, right, every week. And so that's actually one of the dynamics that's happening here, right? Is labor is becoming cheaper, and what that also means is a bigger share of working people are not actually working productively, but they're basically working in some form or another as sort of the bought servants of people who have a lot of money. And there's obviously a lot of degrees of that, right? You could even say when anyone here gets Uber Eats, which I'm sure we've all done, we're a little bit in that class, right? We're having someone else be our servant. But for people who are living in these mansions with like 10 staff people, that's obviously a whole nother level. Okay. Yeah. I like this.
This probably isn't in these chapters of Capital, but this makes me think just about service work in general. And I work in the childcare industry, and just sort of what it means for that kind of work where the productivity isn't great, but so great because it's not able to be, or so we think now, we'll see, not as able to be technologized, and these people are most often really low paid. And anyone who is making a greater wage and now has to have multiple people working in the family need to do more of their reproductive work, have switched it to being in the market. And so the rich might be buying armies of servants, but the working class also is having to do more of this work. And so we have a new kind of work introduced because of this.
Precisely. Yeah, and we are actually going to get a little more into it. Great question. Yeah. Sorry, Mom.
So just leading into your point about how, I guess, ordering Uber Eats and that sort of thing is like a small version of this. Well, you have people that become more and more gig workers.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Which, if you remember, we talked about too last time as a form of absolute surplus value extraction also, right? Because it escapes the 8-hour day, which is law in this country, but more and more people work outside of the law because of gig work, because of multiple jobs. So, I mean, I'll just say one of the things I found every time I read Capital, which, has only been for the last 10 years, is that it does seem like a lot of the ideas in it are like more and more relevant for a lot of these things. So thanks for the questions. Let's just keep it going this whole lecture. And I want to jump into chapter 11 on cooperation. So I'll just say basically from this sort of explainer of what relative surplus value is, Marx then goes on to talk about basically how industry has actually changed in history. And he starts with, in a sense, a sort of general idea of cooperation. And I wanted to start by returning to this slide from a number of lectures back, where I was sort of saying Marx has this idea of labor capacity or labor power that's almost mystical, right? It's like this almost infinite capacity of human beings to do anything with their labor. And I actually sort of think it's justified in saying that. Excuse me. But at the time, it does come a little out of the blue, this sort of like power of labor capacity, labor power that humans have. And one of the things that I think adds some depth to it is this idea of cooperation. And just noting that basically when human labor capacities are working in cooperation, on the one hand, they can make the same things but more efficiently, but they can also make entirely new things that a single person could never achieve. And so to take this simple example, right, to put up a large obelisk, this is something you see all over the world, right, in pre-capitalist times. It takes a huge amount of people working in cooperation to build the mound, to pull the stone on rollers up, pull it in, all these various things. If you had one person, doesn't matter how long you work, you're never, ever going to make this obelisk stand up. And so the cooperative nature of human labor is part of what allows basically human labor capacity to have this sort of infinite potential. And so I just want to add that little bit of depth to this idea of when we talk about human labor and what it can do, right? And we can just look around the world today and be like, wow, it can do some crazy things. But a huge part of that is not just that in each human we have some mystical capacity, it's this social cooperation that we do. Okay. And then to draw on another sort of mental trick we've been using, I think the cooperation chapter sort of fits into this idea of the two angles that Marx looks at things from. So if you remember, we sort of talked about this in a number of earlier lectures, but on the one hand, Marx often takes like basic truths about human life, things that he says apply to all human, i.e. social life, always and in all places. And then he also takes a sort of specific form, you know, how it actually works in history, the actual and historically specific social relations between human beings. We said that, right, like use value is a basic truth. We always need useful things. Value, monetary value, is a historically specific character of commodities under capitalism. And cooperation sort of fits into the same framework, right? So throughout history, human cooperation has unlocked new powers of social labor. And Marx basically goes through that in that chapter, right? Where he says the pyramids, all these various things have been produced through cooperative labor. In capitalism, we're now going to go forward and talk about the specific way that capitalism structures human cooperation in the production process, specifically the manufacturing system and large-scale industry. And so he's sort of framing cooperation as this sort of broad underlying theory to understand the coming chapters. And I think that sometimes flies under the radar. So I just wanted to highlight that for people. Despite that, he does talk about simple cooperation, which is sort of like just cooperating, not any of the more complex forms, not any of the, you know, historic developments, and basically says that just by cooperating, simple cooperation, workers can achieve new and better things like pulling up the obelisk. They can increase the efficiency of work. If anyone's ever worked when you're trying to move something, throwing it from person to person rather than one person carrying it up, it's amazing. I'll just say, as someone who's done it a couple times, it's amazing how much faster you get just with this sort of simple cooperation. It's the same action of moving a brick. He also notes that cooperation creates this spirit of competition and pushes workers to work at least the average amount, right? If you're working on a team, you don't want to be the one who's lazy, who's skimping, you know. And then finally, just by cooperating, some of the means of production are shared, and that lowers the costs. So if you're sharing a workshop, if you can share a tool that you only use, you know, every rare once in a while with 10 other people, that's actually a lot more efficient. Not everyone needs to have one of those tools. And so just simple cooperation already increases productivity or efficiency. But he does want to go into this, the more specifically capitalist form of increasing productivity or of production, which starts with the division of labor and the manufacturing system, chapter 12. Okay. And so with this one, we're basically getting into what is actually happening under capitalism and how is capitalism transforming the labor process. And he starts by sort of asking, like, what does capitalism start with, right? And says, capitalism starts with various kinds of artisanal labor processes. So this is an image of sort of a seamstress from, I think it's the early 1700s. You can see it's mostly done by hand. It's done in the shop. It's a smaller group of people. But there's already this highly advanced technical skill that's available through all these artisanal forms of labor. And that's what capital starts with, is it starts with this artisanal, you know, we already made cloth long before capital. We already made clothes. We already made shoes. We already made so many of the things we use today for a long time before capital ever existed. And so what does it do when it starts with this artisanal type of production? It breaks it up. So more workers are brought into one workshop. I'll just say this example here on the left is the pin factory that Adam Smith uses and Marx also references. But basically, more workers are brought together in one workshop. The various tasks that are involved are divided up into very small parts and sent or assigned to specific specialized workers. So in the pin factory example, right, there's someone who just draws out the wire, there's someone who straightens it, there's someone who cuts it, there's someone who points it. And each of these tasks, they're relatively simple, but you are still handling sort of, hot metal and using specialized tools. It's not something you could walk off the street and make a pin. It is still, in a sense, artisanal, and in another sense, specialized, almost just like a sort of individual task. And so the artisan becomes the specialized worker who uses these highly specific tools that are designed just for the one task they're using. And alongside, Marx sort of mentions this, alongside these specialized workers, basically like the pin factory becomes a line of various specialized workers. Alongside them, there's also a growth in some unskilled workers who, for example, right, are just carting coal around the workshop in a wheelbarrow. That is something you can pretty much walk off the street and you can do. You don't need to be a semi-artisan. And so it's sort of this, in the manufacturing period, the growth of these two types of worker that he talks about. And Marx calls this division of labor within the workshop, this breaking up of all the tasks, bringing people together, the detailed, or I'm going to call it the technical, I find that to be a more useful term, it was in the old translation, the technical division of labor. Yeah. And so basically what you get at the end is something that looks a little bit like this, right? So instead of the weavers sitting sort of three women in a workshop, maybe switching between roles, some people are always doing one thing, some people are always pulling the thread in some way. There's sort of this agglomeration of workers that form a whole, but each person has become just one specialized part. And they're doing a repetitive task again and again and again. You end up sort of changing what your body looks like, right? The muscles you use end up being sort of changed based on what work you're doing in this sort of distorted way. So Marx talks about all these effects of basically the specialized worker. Excuse me. And basically calls it a machine made out of people. And I took these examples from Black Swan, just as sort of a figurative, the Black Swan ballet, sort of figurative example, right? It's like you're producing something that's a linkage of all these people together, and that's how it works and becomes something. It's not something any individual person could do. And basically, in order for this to happen, in order for these manufacturing workshops to develop, you need a larger division of labor. So just to read the quote here, right? The division of labor in the manufacturing system presupposes that the division of labor within society has already reached a certain level of development. Why is that? Because if you're going to be making cloth or shoes with manufacturing, you better have a big market, right? You better be making for a whole city, or at least a good part of a city. You can't be doing this in a little town. You're going to need to buy bulk amounts of yarn. That's not something you could do in the 1500s in the same way. But, he says, the inverse is also true. Through a rebound effect, the manufacturing system's division of labor, the technical division of labor, further develops and enlarges the social division of labor. And so one of the examples Marx gives of this, right, is that in watchmaking, basically, even though there's all these various different steps to make the watch, those ended up becoming separate industries. So now there's a whole industry just making springs, which never existed before the watch. And so it's doing both of these things. It's on the one hand dependent upon the array of the social division of labor, and it's on the other hand sort of creating and expanding the social division of labor. And I want to just take a step back here because hopefully people are getting this, but clarify the terms. There are two sides to the division of labor when Marx talks about it. And division of labor, I'll just say, I feel like it's a very important term or idea in Marx, is thinking about how society, right? We talked about it in early classes as like a social organism, how that organism is divided up into different pieces that are relating one to the other. And so if you remember from way back, this is, I think, lecture 1 or 2, The social division of labor in capitalism is basically a bunch of independent commodity producers relating through the market. And so just to say again what I said in the last slide, right? Manufacturing depends on being able to go to the market and buy huge quantities of your raw materials and be able to go to the market and sell huge quantities of your product. And that sort of depends on this existing throughout society, this sort of common dependence and interaction through the market. The technical or detailed division of labor is all the splitting up of all the little tasks inside the workshop. It's that pin factory, right? It's having these 10 workers stand in a line and each do just one task again and again all day. You could say the social division is commodity exchange on the market between industries, and the technical and or detailed division of labor is the despotic organization of labor within the workplace, within one firm. And I just wanted to go into this again based on some of the terms we had from the past, right? So when we're talking about the social division of labor, we're talking about value, which if you remember this image from some of the past lectures, it sort of is a stand-in for this weird system of value that capitalism produces where every object seems to have an inherent worth to it. We're talking about people trading commodities on the market according to their value, using money. When we talk about the technical or the detailed division of labor, we're talking about this direct despotic control inside the workplace. So this is actually a diagram from a sort of Taylorist management handbook, right? You want to have the manager, you want to have these, two sort of planning figures, all these various disciplinarian figures, all on top of the workman. Of course, it's not just one workman in this case. And so I just wanted to note, in the first part of the book up through, I think, chapter 4, we're in the realm of circulation, right? We're in the realm of Bentham, of equality. Everyone's a free commodity seller, a free commodity buyer, et cetera, et cetera. Many people relate this sort of part, right, if we're thinking more ideologically, to a lot of the ideas of sort of bourgeois government. Everyone's a free citizen. Everyone has equal rights. But within capitalism, there's also a whole nother side, which is despotic and detailed control within the actual workplace. And I'll just note, I find it interesting to think that throughout the history of capitalism, you see both of these sides, right, emerging. So we could say right now, as we see some of these right-wing governments emerging, doing some of this more despotic stuff, it's not that they're, drawing from nowhere. They're drawing from an experience that many of us have in life of this sort of well-regulated, productive machine. And so capitalism has both of these sides. And it's only when you only look at circulation that you see the freedom, the Bentham. When you look inside the factory, you see the despotic control as well. Okay. And this is where Marx brings up something historically unique about capitalism. And I'll just say, whenever Marx notes something like this, I like to take note because I'm like, okay, here he's laying out some fundamental difference between how we live now versus how people used to live. And he basically says that if we look at these two types of division of labor, capitalism has reversed them. And so back, in pre-capitalist days, this is specifically looking at Europe, the social division of labor was heavily regulated by guilds, by custom, by caste, by law. This is just a diagram from sort of a large book, basically, about how all the different guilds fit together and how they related to the nobility. But basically, you see this throughout many of the sort of social forms that form larger societies, hierarchical societies, you could say, is there's this sort of intricate regulation of the social division of labor. But alongside that, there's actually mostly little regulation or control over the technical or the detailed division of labor. So you have this painting from Bruegel, if anyone knows him, of the 15th century Dutch painter, of the peasants working the fields. Obviously, there's technological advancement here, but this is not a heavily controlled process. They're eating, some of them are working, some of them are not. You sort of get to choose your own time a little bit. There's maybe some external discipline pushing you to work more and more and more, but there's not much technical control of the actual work of every person. This is largely left to the decision of the direct producer. And capitalism basically reverses that relationship. So on the side of the social division of labor, that's largely left to the anarchy of the market. And you get this sort of chaotic image of society, right? It's not coherent. One force is battling another. People are rising, people are falling. But then on the technical or the detailed division of labor side, you get this incredibly despotic and detailed control of the capitalist that develops the productive activity. So, in this case, just looking at the picture, right, this is, again, a clothing factory. And you can see that not only is each one highly regulated, but there's all these various steps each piece of clothing goes through up and down the line to get made. And so capitalism basically as a form, one of the things that's just interesting about it is that it's sort of historically reversed these relationships. And on the one hand, unleashed these sort of insane, both revolutionary and sort of anarchistic forces on society. But on the other hand, developed the actual detailed or technical division of labor in a way that no other previous social formation has done. Okay. And with that, I wanted to jump into machinery and large-scale industry, which, if you look at the page count here, is a more than 100-page chapter. So hopefully people are making their way through that one. I do like this chapter. It is one of the longest in the book. I think only competition is chapter 25. And so, yeah, let's jump into it. I just wanted to start with Marx's definition of the machine. And I'm going a little further here because I'm already sort of doing the factory, the sort of combined machine, but the elements are the same. Marx basically says if you look at a machine objectively from afar, it ends up having three parts. It has some sort of motive mechanism, which that's a old steam engine here with a big flywheel, right, to keep it consistent. So it has some sort of motive mechanism that's providing the force that drives the machine. It then has some sort of transmitting mechanism. So what they used to do in these old factories is they'd link up this steam engine to a variety of rods across the ceiling, you can see up there, that would basically transmit the rotational force across the whole factory. And then each individual machine is tied up to one of these rods that's rotating. And so all of that is the transmitting mechanism, right? It's transmitting the force to the end part, which is the tool machine. And basically, what do you see here? You see the same tool that the specialized worker used, right? The same tool that now has become so specialized it's only useful for one very specific task, one specific motion, but put in the hands of a mechanical machine that can do that motion much, much faster, and in fact, almost perfectly. And so in fact, it's this specialized worker, and it's that division of tasks that happens in manufacturing that ends up finding its way into the machine. And then capitalism develops the machine further, right? Because no longer is it limited by the worker. And that's what we're going to get into next. He has a number of these sort of, I don't know if other people caught these, but these sort of eerie descriptions of manufacturing versus large-scale industry, where, for example, he says that in the manufacturing system, the organization of the social labor process is purely a matter of organizing people. It amounts to combining specialized workers. Large-scale industry, on the other hand, possesses in the machine system an entirely objective organization of production, which confronts the worker as a pre-existing material condition of production. And he actually is going to go on and talk a lot about that idea of the objective, right? And he even says, something that I find useful to think about a little bit, but he says like a lot of modern science and the development of modern science, you can really trace back to this idea of machinery and the objective organization of production. No longer is it a human doing it, it's a piece of metal, right? It's a chemical process. And so we're actually trying to understand objectively how the world works in order to build machinery. We're trying to think about chemistry, mechanics, other types of physics. And so this form of production both depends on and provides an impetus for a lot of the scientific discoveries and developments that we've ended up seeing. But it is very different, right? You're you're basically confronted with an objective production process that works often according to the objective physical laws of mechanics, chemistry, electromagnetism, et cetera. And as a worker, you're just sort of there to be an appendage to the process. And that's also another one of these comparisons Marx does. This is starting with the large-scale industry, owing to the technology it entails, large-scale industry overcomes the division of labor and manufacturing, where the whole of the human being is tied for life to a specialized operation. So Marx is already critical, right, of the manufacturing system, where from being this sort of artisanal figure, which if you read some of the political writing in the 1800s, this artisanal figure is a huge figure. People like Proudhon, Lassalle, a lot of these big figures are basically idealizing this artisanal shoemaker, for example, who is skilled, is proud of their work, feels in control of the work they do. And Marx is saying, in comparison to that, you're turned to someone who just knows how to polish leather, right? You're turned into just one specialized person. But industry goes much farther. It overcomes that, but at the same time, the capitalist form of large-scale industry reproduces the workshop's division of labor as something altogether more monstrous. Inside true factories, the worker is transformed into the thinking and speaking appendage of a specialized machine. So from being a part of this sort of human machine, right, you become this appendage of a mechanical objective production process that's happening independent of you. And I did want to show a little movie clip, which hopefully some of you recognize. Charlie Chaplin, Modern Times. Yeah. So it's a great little clip. If anyone hasn't watched this, I mean, it's an obvious take on a lot of these sort of dynamics. I personally love when humor is applied to things that are, in a sense, not funny. But I think Charlie Chaplin is great at that. But I'll just note a couple of things here, right? First, you can see how, because the machine, in this case, this sort of assembly line, right, is moving at its own speed, Charlie Chaplin, there's no way, right? He has to work at the speed of the machine. He is an appendage of it. He can't slow down or speed up. His own work is regulated by the motion of the larger automaton. And then on the other hand, you basically have these figures who are going around docking pay, oh, you're causing a slowdown in the factory, we dock you 2 hours pay. So there's a whole code that develops within the factory to sort of tie the workers into the more industrial and automated method. And then, the last little part, which they make humorous use of here, right, is that the level of sort of the motion and the intensity produces this almost automatic, crazy, right? I'm doing my chicken wings here with Charlie, but this sort of motion that one, obviously, in a similar way to the specialized worker, but doubled or tripled in intensity, transforms the body, and two, becomes this sort of automatic, almost impossible twitch. That's a joke throughout the rest of the movie, actually, him walking around. Okay, so the factory and the machine turns the worker in this way into a sort of appendage of a larger production process. in which basically what they're doing is determined by the larger machine. They're no longer a part of it. They're sort of outside, being brought in and being forced to correspond. This brings us to a big question that takes up a good, well, yeah, let's take a pause. Did you have a question, Mike? Or?
It also generates an immediate pushback.
Yeah.
So that assembly line was going way too fucking fast. The
Yeah.
control, there's a rheostat down there,
Yeah.
and somebody's going to turn that down.
Yeah.
You know, and the other workers are going to be, you know, they're going to be supportive. They're not going to say
Yeah.
that Charlie's a nuts. They're going to say, yeah.
They're not going to say he's
fucking
crazy. Yeah.
down.
Yeah.
Anyway, I just had to say that.
I appreciate it.
We used to take turns when the foreman wasn't looking, like running down and
Slowing down.
turning.
Okay. Okay, that's great. Because that also helps ease this sort of drastic transition, you could say, into the question of value. So from this question of like, how does the machine actually operate in production? How does the value of the machine get brought into the product or relate to the value of the product? And obviously that's a key question, right? Because we spent a lot of time developing this idea of commodity value. And I wanted to start by just doing a little review, which this is a slide from last lecture, this idea of constant capital. So if you remember, this is a sort of more basic idea that whenever we're doing production, whenever we're doing capitalist production, some part of the money the capitalist invests is going to purchase the raw materials and the tools that are needed for the labor process. These are basically past dead labor that's already congealed into a commodity with a value. And so if we're looking at sort of this like supply chain in the right, it's these things that happened before the actual current labor process we're talking about. This value is simply transferred along to the final product because the related commodity is a necessary part of the means of production. And so I sort of talked about in this last lecture, but an easy way I think for me to think about it is that if you take the longer view, right, the labor that goes into the raw material or the tool is just a part of the labor to eventually produce the final product. That's happened earlier in time, and so it's transferred over as it sort of gets used up in a later stage of the production process. The difference here is that rather than happening inside one factory, this earlier step has happened in another factory and has now been traded on the commodity market. But the value doesn't change. It's simply transferred. And that's why we call this part the constant capital. And basically, the machine is constant capital in the same way that the hammer is, right? Even though it's a totally different object, from this sort of question of like how value gets transferred and how value gets treated, the machine is no different. And so just to walk through it, right, there's a bunch of dead labor. I use this sort of diagram from past lectures embedded in something like a weaving machine. And so that might be raw material mining, right, to make all the metal, et cetera. It might be the manufacturing of the machine itself, the assembly. It might be quality control of the machine, et cetera. All of that is past dead labor that's been embodied in the machine itself. And then the machine is used, let's say for 5 years, an average of 5 years in production. And so that whole time, it's a means of production for producing rolls of fabric. And during that whole time, it's transferring the past dead labor into the new rolls of fabric. The labor is embodied, that's embodied in the machine, is socially necessary to produce the fabric using machine production, and thus the value is transferred over. And I'll just note that because there's so many yards of fabric that are produced over these 5 years, each roll is only getting a tiny little piece of the value of the machine, right? So it's not that it's making every roll more expensive. In fact, it's making them cheaper, right? That's why it's brought in. There are some extra complexities when we deal with machines. Marx mentions a couple. I'm going to just highlight these two. But he says that on the one hand, alongside a machine's material decline, it also suffers a kind of moral depreciation, which is a funny term he uses, I think, for basically general technological advancement. So if you have a machine, you know, like this from the 1870s, like was wrapped up in that factory we saw the painting of earlier, and 50 years later, you find it in your warehouse, and now it's this green machine that's being used to produce fabric. Your machine is pretty much a historical artifact. It's not worth anything as an actual machine because it's so much less efficient than the current modern machines. And so when you produce a machine, there's this need to sort of use its value before it morally depreciates and becomes, in a sense, no longer socially necessary for machine production. And then on the other hand, we mentioned this before, but Marx does talk about sort of the natural forces and the natural sciences that are involved in large-scale industry. And he says, we can therefore see at a glance that large-scale industry dramatically increases labor's productivity by incorporating immense natural forces and natural science into the production process. So, you know, imagine here a 600 horsepower steam engine. You're coming from being a peasant farmer in some part of England. You walk into the factory and you see this machine that's, you know, 20 times larger than you are and produces the force that's not even imaginable. You know, it's not a force you've ever felt before. Immense natural forces. Nowadays, those sorts of forces are almost every day to us. You know, we just watch a car roll down the road. But you go into an actual factory and you'll see similar types of immense natural forces that are brought into the production process. But he says, it is harder to recognize that this enhanced productive power doesn't come at the cost of greater expenditures of labor. And so he's just noting that even though we have these immense developments in, you know, mechanics and science in our use of natural forces, in a sense, these are sort of free gifts of past human labor. You know, other people have worked, in many cases, long, long hours to initially discover how electricity works or various types of chemical reaction. But once those things have been discovered, to use them in a new machine takes no new labor, right? And so in a sense, it doesn't require investment or cost. And obviously there's various ways of sort of managing this in modern capitalism, patents, et cetera, to try to make that only half true. But in general, it's true that the scientific legacy of the last 200 years is available for free to capitalists who are producing. And it doesn't come at the cost of greater expenditures of labor. And so I just wanted to go through a really quick example of basically what would happen if a firm switched from a hand loom, which is pictured here, right? And you can see, in a sense, the hand loom is still a machine, right? It's just that the motive force is the actual person sort of swaying on the boards to push the turner. And then the transmitting mechanism is within the machine itself. And the tool is also within the machine itself. But switching from this hand loom, which is still relatively early, to a power loom. And let's just say, you know, hypothetically, that this doubles the productive capacity of the worker to make it a little easier for us to do math. So I just wanted to go through it and note that, right, if we take the total value of one roll of fabric, given that in society, most people are using hand looms, you would see probably a big chunk of it is raw material, right? A lot of the value in a roll of fabric is just the thread that goes into it that you have to purchase. Some part of it is the hand loom. Some part of it is that necessary labor that corresponds to the wage of the worker. And then some part is surplus labor. And so what happens? Well, at first, the value of the raw materials, just to note it, stay the same, right? We're still using the same amount of thread. It hasn't changed its value. The power loom, it's more expensive, but at the same time, it's more productive. So it's spreading that expense over more things. So let's just presume that it also stays about the same, which I think is a fair assumption. But with double productivity, the amount of the necessary labor is reduced by half. And so basically that necessary labor gets crunched down, and you have a significant amount of surplus labor in each roll of fabric. And this is the moment, right? We're the first to introduce a new productive machinery, the power loom. We're making tons of extra surplus labor, tons of extra surplus value and profit. And so we're riding high. And this is actually exactly the same dynamic that we just covered in an earlier section, right? So it's the same because the working day is twice as productive, it ends up counting in a different way. But over time, that no longer holds, right? So over time, as the power loom gets generally introduced, the rolls of fabric actually just become cheaper. They're cheaper to produce, so they become cheaper. And so you have still the same raw materials, still the same portion of the power loom, but instead the necessary and surplus labor have been reduced to a smaller amount. And because that fabric is cheaper, fabric is, part of clothes. It's something we all buy all the time. And so the wage can get reduced a little bit, the real wage, right? Because clothes are cheaper. Or not the real wage, sorry, the value wage. The amount of hours going to produce the clothes of the workers has been reduced somewhat. And so overall, now you're no longer making those giant profits, but it has translated society-wide, and there's a little bit less necessary labor that's going to sort of reproduce the working class. But at this point, if you're the capitalist, you're like, damn, my golden day is over. I'm just making the normal profit pretty much. But very importantly, something has happened in this transformation, which is that basically if you take that same roll of fabric and you don't think of it just as one roll, but you think of it proportionally compared to the roll that was made during the hand loom sort of production method, you see that the constant capital part has increased pretty dramatically. And so in the mass of all these products that are produced, a lot more of the value is traced back to the constant capital, the raw materials, the machines, versus the variable capital hiring new workers. And so this is part of what machinery does, is it basically replaces the variable part with the constant part. It uses machinery to vastly increase production. That means a lot more raw materials also, right? Well, you're sort of using less workers. And that is particularly important because we're going to see it come up again in chapter 25. But basically because, right, it means that there's a competition between worker and machine. And this is one of the sections in that machinery chapter, if you want to go back and take a look. The image in the back, it's only half clear, is a sort of Luddite image of the workers breaking the machine. He has a whole section in there about the Luddites, about why it made sense for them to destroy the machines. And why even, for them, I think this is not always known, right? But they weren't just against machinery in general. They were against the machines that were being introduced in their factories that were destroying their sort of work, their livelihoods. And so one of the things that's new about large-scale industry is it really introduces this competition between the machine and the worker. And a way to think through this is just ask, when will a capitalist introduce machinery? And I'll take an example that hit true for me, which is, when I was much younger visiting Europe briefly, I went into a number of gas stations, fast food restaurants, and realized that in Europe, even back in 2011, all these places had the touchscreens that we now see in a lot of our gas stations and fast food restaurants. No one was ordering from a person at the cashier. And so I found this article when I was making this presentation, but that describes it, right? It says, specifically in 2011, McDonald's added 64,000 people to its payroll in the US, but job prospects in Europe for those so inclined to work in the fast food industry are looking pretty grim because McDonald's had bought 7,000 kiosks for self-ordering. And so, right, what's going on here? Basically, because workers are paid more in Europe, it made sense for McDonald's to replace them with these sorts of machines. In the United States, because the minimum wage is much lower in many places, it didn't make sense to do it, even though the same machine was available. And that's sort of the logic that is determining a lot of these decisions, right? The capitalist is comparing the value of the machine to the value of the labor power saved by the machine, not the actual hours worked. The McDonald's worker in the US and in Europe are working the same hours, but the labor power cost, the wages, are different. And that's what capital is comparing. And thus, where workers are paid more, like in Europe, it makes sense to bring in and introduce more machinery. Where workers are paid much less, capitalists will hire more workers rather than invest in expensive machines. And I think Marx has this sort of bleary moment, if you remember, where he talks about how they're still using human labor to pull barges along some part of the river in England because, well, a, steam engine or other form of, or a horse has a definitive value, I think he says. The value of the lives of the surplus population is uncalculably low. And so capital is not just something that always brings in machines. It actually has this sort of internal limit. When labor is cheap, it will use labor. Machines and labor are in this sort of competition. And it goes even farther than that, just this sort of like abstract economic logic. Just to read from Marx here, he says, machinery doesn't simply act as the unstoppable competition forever about to make the wage laborer redundant. For workers, it is a hostile force. Loudly and widely proclaiming it as such, capital uses it accordingly. Machinery is the most powerful weapon for putting down workers' periodic revolts against capital's autocratic rule, strikes, and so on. I don't know, for those of you that are interested in this sort of thing, there's actually a little paragraph right in there too, where he talks about how basically the introduction of coal and the steam engine was a way to overcome all these early worker revolts in England, which is the paragraph that then Andres Malm takes and runs with and basically writes Fossil Capital. He basically took the inspiration from that small piece. I'll also note, reading this, it made me think of, if anyone has become or is a reader of the Bay Area Current, the articles they've been doing on these tech billboards, right? Where you'll see a billboard in San Francisco that says, hire AI, don't hire a worker. But it's this sort of hostile, it's like an actively hostile force. And it's proclaimed loudly and widely as such. They're paying to put it up there. So again, just to remind ourselves, like machinery under capitalism has these sort of specific effects that are different than it would have just in the abstract. In the abstract, it makes us more productive. It makes us more efficient. It increases the powers of human labor. But in the specific, it does some different things. And fundamentally, what does it actually do? I'm going to pull out these 4 effects. I think you could probably pull out some more, but these cover a lot of the bases. 1, it pushes for the further extension of the workday, including night work. And if you remember back to the working day chapter, Marx goes into this a lot, actually. You can now see it in a new light from this chapter, right? It's a capitalist doesn't want their machines to go to waste. I've put so many millions of pounds into my giant, clothing factory. How could I leave it off at night? Isn't that, destroying my investment? And so actually the use of machines leads the capitalist to push to further extend the workday, which is part of the reason the factory laws even come into play, right? Is because this drive has caused capital to go so far beyond the limits of a human being that people are working 18 hours, children are dying when they're young, all these different things that you see in that chapter. 2, machinery intensifies labor because workers must increasingly match the speed of the machine, which the boss can easily ramp up, the workers can also ramp down. So I just thinking of that same Charlie Chaplin scene, the way that the machine sort of is itself a disciplinarian and forces you to work at a certain speed. And you can take some of this same logic, right? And even though it doesn't perfectly apply, you can extend it right into like the Amazon warehouse of today, where every motion is monitored. And if you're caught doing a slightly inefficient motion, that's docked. And then if there's too many of those in a month, someone talks to you, and et cetera. So it intensifies labor. It makes labor more intense and difficult for the worker. 3, it erodes the power and organization of the working class by replacing organized and or well-paid workers with machines and producing unemployment. So this is what we were just talking about, right? That hostile relationship. And Marx has a number of examples of this, right? Right in the industries where the workers' unions are getting the strongest, in the weavers' union, they have a lot of coordination among the different workers. That's when the boss brings in the power loom, and those workers go from being relatively organized, somewhat well-paid, to being the surplus population of England for the next 50 years. And so this power to sort of compete with workers and worker organization by bringing in a new machine is a huge weapon in the hand of the capitalist class. And then fourth, this is in a sense the relative surplus value part, right? It cheapens the means of subsistence as much as possible so that the working class can be reproduced with the minimum amount of social labor and more can go to the rich. So I'll just say when I was reading and thinking through this is reflects some of my funny California energy, but I was like, think of all this plastic crap that we all live off these days and how cheap it is to make and how much worse it looks than the stuff people used to make, right? This is a way of cheapening the means of subsistence. And in fact, we're getting something worse. We're getting something that maybe is unhealthy, is also just sort of uglier, breaks more easily, et cetera. And so these are actually the main forces that machinery advances in capitalism. And none of these are particularly good. So that's why it's had a sort of storied tale. There's been huge amounts of, currently and in the past, worker organizing around the use of automation in industry. And so, yeah, I just want to note that. But I wanted to also sort of shift gears a little bit and talk about the effects of machinery and large-scale industry, not specifically sort of in the abstract, but historically and how it's transformed society, which is another big part of this chapter. And so people maybe will recognize this is the Detroit industry mural, Diego Rivera in Detroit. But you can see there, obviously, right, machinery has transformed how these people are working. That's the whole subject of this image. But I wanted to just go through some of the main things it's done historically. And the first key large thing is machinery basically obliterates the peasantry, which are, up to that point, the great mass of humanity. And it turns them into proletarians. And so this is, it's hard to sort of overstate how radical of a transformation this is in social life. You go to China in 1910s, I think even, and it's something like 96% of people are peasants or agricultural workers. You can see just the little end of that graph, which keeps going since 2019. That's much, much, much lower. What is going on here? It's basically the introduction of large-scale industry to agriculture itself, which competes with peasant production and makes it impossible to live as a peasant. Second, Marx says it destroys the human metabolism with nature, which now must be reestablished in new ways. I picked this image of just a giant garbage dump here, but there's obviously the very ever-present example of climate change and a variety of other ways that large-scale industry has sort of ripped apart the classic human metabolism with nature, which you see, if you go back, right, you're living in a general area, the things you produce end up in the ground around there. The metabolism with nature is not too far broken. That is no longer true in any way. It completely transforms the daily work activity of all the population, though not in the way that many Marxists thought it would. And so this is getting at the question from earlier, thank you. But basically what we've seen in this development of large-scale industry is that there is obviously a manufacturing workforce. I will note this is the US, so a part of that dip right there, right, is the internationalization of manufacturing to other countries. But the manufacturing workforce never ended up taking over all of society, which is what a lot of Marxists in the early 1900s thought it would do. It always ended up staying as a relatively small but significant portion. Well, what ended up taking up the majority of social labor was service and other work. And this is actually something that when you pay attention, you see this possibility in the book itself. So I don't think this would come as much of a surprise to Marx as it does to a lot of the Marxists in the 1900s. But I will note, the last one there, right, is that agriculture part you see, the destruction of the peasantry or anything like the peasantry by the introduction of machinery. And so, yeah, we're going to get maybe a little more into this, but I want to cover first this idea of so-called domestic industries. So I just want to note that Marx does not say that machinery will take over all industries in society. He says that when machinery takes over the core industries of society, it will produce new forms of domestic industry, new forms of manufacturing, and as we mentioned before, right, a large section of basically servants of various forms. And I don't know if Uber really works perfectly for this example, but I did want to take it, right? It's this introduction of some computer machine, highly efficient, quote unquote, that has basically taken over the taxi industry, but it exports the actual work to domestic units, people often using their own cars, independent drivers, supposedly. This is very similar to what Marx is describing in the chapter, right? When he says that, you know, a lace factory, for example, will produce the lace en masse and then send big rolls home with its workers so that they can sew it up into certain shapes at home, because that can happen at home. So it's all these ways of pushing certain parts of the work into other spheres. The capitalist doesn't have to pay for the workshop or all these other things. And the capital just sits at the top. The high industry sits at the top and then delegates work to the domestic sphere, to manufacturing, et cetera. So again, you know, Uber is not technically domestic. It's not actually in the home, but you can think of a variety of types of work or other things that sort of fit this same rule today, where basically, even though there's obviously heavy industry that's involved, it's been sort of pushed into the home. And then finally, it dramatically increases the number of modern servants and services aimed at the wealthy as labor becomes cheaper and profits larger. And I just want to note here, right? I don't know if anyone else had that surprising moment, but you get to that end of a certain section in this chapter, and Marx basically lists out what the main working occupations are in England. And he then combines more than the textile workers and the machine workers and the miners is just the modern servants. So even in the 1800s, this dynamic of industry not producing, he sort of says the irony, right? How our great productive powers have produced the most servile work. It doesn't necessarily produce everyone becoming a factory worker. It produces a lot of people becoming modern servants. And that's something obviously we do see today. And so just to note again, right, all of these various developments in machinery, they fit into this sort of advancement of productivity that ultimately is producing relative surplus value, is shrinking the amount of social production that's going to uphold, to maintain, and to basically the amount that goes to us living. And it's increasing the amount that goes to, you know, new investment, military, super yachts, luxury, passion projects like rocket ships, et cetera. So yeah. I did want to just note here, I've always gotten to this part of the book and I've just felt like, man, I wish there were like maybe one more chapter here, right? Because this was written in 1873. And so there's just been a lot of development in industry since then. And that chapter is not written. I'm sure there are some Marxist books that have attempted versions of writing follow-ups that sort of follow some of the same logics that Marx is talking about. But I did want to just briefly go over some of the main technological developments that have happened since Marx's time. And so basically, you know, even if the exact logic of machinery might not perfectly bear out for a lot of these, certainly the logic of relative surplus value does, right? They're all about reducing the amount of time that goes to sort of upkeep of the worker in a sense. And in many ways, I've just found when I think about them, they do fit the same logic of machinery. And so first, I'm going to just say there's sort of this idea of like machinery going everywhere and society being one big machine. So on the one hand, right, the transmission mechanism from the steam engine to the weaving machine is no longer in the factory itself. Actually, the weaving machine has become a coal power plant that's connected by a transmission network across the entire country to every single machine and every single factory. So this grand socialization of the machine as an object, in a similar, though I would say not quite as neat way, right? The development of roads and then the putting of literal machines in the hands of everyone so they can travel 2 hours to work. You know, factories can be built out in the hinterlands where there's much more space more cheaply, et cetera. And then, of course, the introduction of domestic machines, which are possible only because of the electric grid and the ability to sort of plug into the grand social machine right in your outlet. All these are sort of things that happen in the era of the 1920s, 10s, 30s. Past that, you see the introduction of electronics and control. There's actually a huge wave of automation in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, where you even see, I think here, right, the first industrial robots in car production. You see the television, you see the first use of offshore oil rigs and this sort of massive oil production, and this sort of like electronic control of the factory itself, which replaces a lot of working jobs with, the monitor as a figure. That's something that happens throughout this time, and all of these times, right, are huge developments in human knowledge and scientific knowledge that enable all of this stuff to occur. And then if you want to bring it up to the present, you have, the computerization, the internet, these various large-scale technologies that are changing our world today, whether it's sort of the web of interconnections across the whole globe that are wrought by fiber optic cables, the sort of extreme automation that's enabled by computerization and modern robotics, the daily introduction of a new commodity that we all need in our life, the phone, the computer. And then this is a picture of a fab that's producing those chips, which are, incredibly expensive and sort of intricate factories. And so I just want to note that there's probably new things to say about all of this, which Marx could not really have imagined back in the 1870s. I do think a lot of these things can be helped by thinking through the logic of the large-scale industry chapter, certainly the logic of relative surplus value, but there's also certainly new aspects of these things, right? The way, well, I'll get into a list of them in the next slide, but there's new aspects that Marx doesn't perfectly cover that exist in the capitalist technology of today. And so it sort of leaves us, I took this image from way back in lecture 1, right? It leaves us in this sort of postmodern swamp where, we have to deal with the continuing invasion of technology and the tech industry into our psyche, into our private lives, the plastification of the world, intense and unmitigated climate change, hyper-advanced military powers that require very little actual labor or soldiers, all these various forces that determine how our world works today. And so a lot of that is a little beyond what Marx is covering in this chapter, but would be maybe a follow-up chapter if it were rewritten today. So I just wanted to cover it and note that. And then to sort of end, a final note, going back to the two sides of the division of labor. Remember, so on the one hand, we have a social division of labor, which is all these different centers of production that are trading commodities one among the other, right? We have an industry that's making specific type and width of aluminum bar, and another industry that's making a specific type of chewy granola bar. And like that differentiation is the social division of labor, but then also the technical or the detailed division of labor inside the modern factory. And we see both of these things even more developed by large-scale industry. So just as an example, I took this picture here. This is the supply chain of a single laptop computer. So most of these are independent firms trading with one another, but all of this trade and exchange of, for example, like little bits of raw material, right? Chips, certain optical drives, other pieces, the screen, variety of different pieces is required to make one object. But then you start zooming in on any one of these nodes, and you probably will see something closer to this sort of factory that's the size of 60 soccer fields, right? So both the social division of labor and the technical division of labor, the size of the mining apparatus, the technical power of it, et cetera, have increased hugely in the age of large-scale industry. And so, yeah, this is the Tesla factory in Shanghai, but it's huge. I mean, it's much larger than the factories were in the 1870s. I'll just say that it would have been, the factory in the 1870s would have been almost a little outhouse compared to that. And so just to read from the book itself, this is about large-scale industry already in the 1870s. An international division of labor now takes shape, and it operates according to the needs of the main sites of machine-driven production. I'll just note, this is the beginning of the era of imperialism, right? So it really is in a sense, predicting the way that whole parts of the globe would become sort of, well, I'll read the next sentence here. For it transforms one part of the globe into a field of mainly agricultural production that supplies the other part, where production remains primarily industrial with raw material. So this international division of labor in its full form is really something that emerges with large-scale industry, even though it's needed by manufacturing for sure, in some form. And so I just wanted to note how extreme these same divisions have become in our world today. And with that, I am done with this section on machinery. So we got some time for questions, as I noted, if anyone has any at the end. And thank you. Yeah.
Just a question about the wages productivity curve. I believe that part of the increase in productivity was due to an increase in absolute surplus value, because in that period of time, workers were forced to work longer hours compared to before, like the mid 70s, I believe. I'll
You were thinking this.
the quote. I'll get the quote for you. I think it's from something we read in the labor committee.
I am sure you're right, and it's a good corrective. But yeah, clearly what's really happened here on some level is just a huge change in the balance of forces between the working class and the capitalist class. Yeah, and it, I'm sure, includes a lot of increase in absolute surplus value as well, pushing to work more hours, work more intensely, work in more unsafe conditions so that the capital part gets cheaper, et cetera. Any other? Yeah.
Yeah, just to tag on to that, and it seems like that absolute increase is with looking at a family productive unit. Like it might not be an individual, but it was a time where family hours went up, so you were working as a unit 120 or whatever hours.
Yeah.
Pretending there were 40, but 2 people or 3 people needing now to work per family unit.
Yeah. Which is something that in various places happens throughout, right? And so if you read the industry chapter or the working day chapter, you'll see this same dynamic actually playing out in like the 1840s, where the use of machinery, this is actually one of the things that Marx says about machines, which I didn't think it was worth including, but I'll just note. He says the use of machinery creates roles within the factory that can be carried out by the child or the woman and brings them into the factory. And then, right, it's the family wage now that gets spread over both the children and the wife and the father. And so, yeah.
And you mentioned the rise of imperialism, which when you pay workers less, they can purchase more, their purchasing power goes down. You're looking for markets somewhere else. You're looking for other buyers. And that's the drive to, control markets outside of where your factory is.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a big, I'm just re-saying what you're saying, but this is a big part of, I think, how modern imperialism and past imperialism has happened. So just to take an example, right, when I talked about the devastation of the peasantry, a huge amount of that is, right, like in the 70s, we saw the Green Revolution in the US, huge production of agricultural goods within the United States and other advanced economies, which were then distributed very low prices, even for free throughout the world, and basically decimated the peasantry. So the way that a cheap or even a free good ends up being, I mean, I think Marx has some quote in the manifesto about sort of how cheap goods break down all Chinese walls or something. It's maybe not perfectly appropriate today, but it is true that the power to produce cheap goods is a huge part of how capital blasts through other societies. I mean, and it's not just a military power that it uses. Any other questions or thoughts?
Like putting Mexican workers, farm workers, the corn production, we dumped cheap corn in the 70s on Mexico, and we're still feeling the ramifications of that.
Yeah. That was a crazy moment, this green revolution moment. That if anyone who's listening or listening in the future wants to read more on it, it's an interesting moment to read. But you could say it's the fully, it's really where some fundamental threshold in large scale automation and industry is reached in agriculture. And you do have, other than a couple small like fruits and vegetables and certain things, you have a real loss. I mean, now 1% of the workforce needs to work in agriculture, et cetera. Yeah. Any other thoughts, questions? Okay. Well, thanks all. Yeah, we're going to move on and jump into sort of, I would say, the last stage of the book, which is building up to chapter 25, a huge and key chapter. The general law of capitalist accumulation, you can tell from the title. And then we jump into primitive accumulation, which is also very important, sort of going over sort of, colonial history and sort of the early introduction of capitalism at the end. And then we are going to have one last lecture that covers volume 2 and 3 and sort of looks at capital as a whole. So 3 more lectures. We're really towards the end here. And yeah, summer is coming to an end. So hopefully, I know my group took a couple weeks off in summer and maybe everyone's going to be coming back into it with some new energy. So, okay. With that, I'll call it.